This video is going to be on viruses, what they are and what they are not. So let's think back to how we define organisms, how we define living organisms. Some things that we said all living organisms are able to do are metabolize energy, whether that be various types of carbohydrates, glucose, whether it be taking in sunlight energy to give them the initial start to metabolize carbohydrates. Living organisms can also reproduce. Living organisms can maintain some kind of homeostasis. And so this is just remaining the same or resisting changes in the environment. And then organisms, everything we've talked about so far has been made up of cells or composed of cells. And they have genomes of DNA. And finally, let's connect this to the central dogma of biology, which is, of course, DNA to mRNA to protein. And all organisms are able to carry DNA, use it to make mRNA, and then read that mRNA to make proteins. Viruses are unique because they don't do all of these things. They don't fulfill all these categories. Viruses do not deal with energy metabolism. They do not process carbohydrates in the same way that other organisms do. They don't need to store up or gather carbohydrates. They also don't need to break them down. Viruses reproduce in that they can make more viruses, but we'll come back to this one in a minute because they cannot do this alone. Viruses also don't maintain homeostasis. They are very subject to changes in their environments. Viruses are not composed of cells. Some viruses have a lipid membrane, others don't, but viruses do not have cytoplasm, they do not have ribosomes, they don't have other things that we would consider necessary to call a unit a cell. Viruses do have genomes, but it's not always DNA, so we'll say question mark here. Some viruses have a genome of RNA. Does that count? Well, no cellular organisms that we have talked about have genomes of RNA, and in fact, there are no known organisms that carry RNA as their genome instead of DNA. Viruses are the only things that can do that. And then as for the central dogma, viruses do have some sort of genome, but it might not be DNA, it might be RNA. And I don't think that there are any viruses that can perform the whole process of the central dogma, reading DNA, making mRNA, reading mRNA, and making protein. Viruses cannot do that by themselves. So we call viruses abiotic or acellular. They are technically non-living entities. And so these are the reasons why we technically do not consider viruses to be alive. Now, I want to distinguish the difference between viruses and parasites, because parasites are organisms that fulfill these other categories or these other qualifications that we talked about, but they have to do so within another organism. So for example, one of these was metabolizing energy. And And then another important one is homeostasis. And this would include things like maintaining an internal temperature, which we often talk about when we're talking about multicellular organisms and mammals versus reptiles and things like that. But it doesn't always have to refer to maintaining temperature. It could be something as simple as maintaining solute concentrations. So we've talked about bacteria being able to increase or decrease the concentration of some dissolved solutes such as salts or proteins to resist changes in their environment when the osmolarity increases or decreases. So organisms can maintain some type of homeostasis, and parasites can as well, but viruses cannot. So viruses, again, they cannot perform any type of homeostasis. And viruses also cannot metabolize their own energy. Even parasites metabolize energy. They might be getting carbohydrates from the host, but they are still breaking down those carbohydrates themselves, and they're using them to build other structures. And they usually do some sort of the process that we've been talking about in terms of using carbohydrates and building them into other structures, such as cell walls, for example, in terms of plants, and taking those molecules. We could even convert some carbohydrates into amino acids or neurotransmitters, for example. Now, parasites, parasites will do some of those things, but viruses cannot do any of these things in that category, okay? They do not do any type of metabolizing. So what do viruses do, and how is it that they replicate without being able to gain their own energy or maintain homeostasis? And we tend to say reproduce when we're talking about biology, but really for viruses, it's more accurate to say replicate, because they're making more of themselves, and it's not really the same as when organisms reproduce, and we're going to see why. Viruses totally rely on the hosts for almost everything that they do.